Hello and welcome to Projector, and on this episode we find out in the latest installment of the Divergent series what lurks on the other side of the wall in Allegiant. With the faction system destroyed after the revelation that Chicago is an experiment controlled by the survivors of the outside world, the enclosed city is descending into civil war as Naomi Watts' Evelyn and Octavia Spencer's Joanna fight for control. Tris, played by Shailene Woodley, however, wants to meet whoever is on the other side of the wall, and along with Theo James's Four, Ansel Elgort as her brother Caleb, Miles Teller's Peter, Zoe Kravitz's Christina, and Maggie Q's Tori venture beyond the only world they've ever known. There, they're taken to the Bureau of Genetic Welfare, led by Jeff Daniels David, who believes that Tris's genes holds the cure that will save mankind and those in Chicago, but they may not be all that they appear. Okay, so full disclosure, I hadn't actually seen any of the Divergent movies until last week, where I actually watched the previous two movies one day after another, because I hadn't seen any of them and I needed to review this movie. And truth be told, Divergent is probably my least favourite of the young adult adaptation franchises. You know, your Hunger Games, which is just wrapped up, and your Maze Runners. And funnily enough, Divergent feels really generic and derivative. It's very much derivative of the Hunger Games. I mean, it's not a coincidence that the first Divergent movie is 2 hours and 20 minutes long, which is exactly the same running time as the Hunger Games. They so want this to be the next Hunger Games. But it's funny how it also feels exactly like The Maze Runner, despite the fact that that movie came out after the first Divergent movie. But you know what, at least The Maze Runner has something over Divergent, in that it actually has some scares and some genuine thrills in it, which actually gives some adrenaline. Whereas the Divergent series takes a concept that makes no sense whatsoever and renders it in the blandest form possible. The concept of diversion is ridiculous. The idea that humanity is separated into these factions divided by personality traits. Initially kind of interesting, but extremely reductive, and the way that Divergent portrays that on screen is never convincing whatsoever. I was chuckling a lot during the first 40 minutes of that movie, before it turned into utterly boring training montages for almost the entire rest of the running time. And then we had Insurgent, which had a different director. It had Robert Schrenke, who also directed this new one, Allegiant, and he previously directed the first Red movie and R.I.P.D. Because that's the guy you want your franchise in the hands of, the guy that directed R.I.P.D. You can tell that no one involved in this movie really cares about it the first time that Shailene Woodley appears on screen, because if you even remotely saw anything to do with Insurgent, you know that Woodley had her hair cut to a pixie cut because she was doing The Fault in Our Stars. That's understandable. What's not understandable is why no one said, hey, why have you allowed your hair to grow out down to your shoulders again? Because this is taking place hours after the previous film where your hair was closely cropped. You don't think anyone's not going to notice that at some point? Apparently no one did, or no one dared to ask. When the lead actress of your franchise doesn't really seem to care about it anymore, yeah, you've got problems. And that apathy is just abundant in everything to do with Allegiant. Although it does lead to one of my favourite parts of the movie, which is Miles Teller's performance. Miles Teller as Peter, he so does not want to be here. He was clearly talked into this role by his agent 2 years ago, saying, oh, you'll be the funny relief character in a franchise, it'll be okay, you'll only have to do a couple of movies. He looks like he would rather be anywhere else. He looks like he would rather be doing Fantastic Four again in this movie. When he delivers snarky, seemingly improvised one-liners, at one point his reaction to seeing this fantastic city in front of him is gadzooks. He is basically doing a Paul Rudd impression in this movie. He does not care about what's happening on screen, and is determined to translate to the audience just how much he has disdain for doing this again. And I can understand it, because this whole franchise feels like they've got all these talented young actors, pop them in one place, and they're just sort of wasted when they could be doing so much better work than this. But every year they have to come back to this and come back to this, and even they know this isn't any good. I've never seen anyone honestly admit they were a Divergent fan, but even if you were a fan of that series, this movie, like the previous one, takes the book and completely rewrites it. It has almost nothing to do with the source material. It takes the loose, bare minimum story and then just goes completely wild with it. You know, as a film viewer, that's not a problem for me. When your 4 writers on this can't come up with an interesting story to replace the one in the book, then that's a problem. What really makes this feel generic is that it feels exactly the same as the Maze Runner The Scorch Trials, which came out in September. This probably isn't helped by the fact that Insurgent had an ending that was almost exactly the same as the Maze Runner, the first Maze Runner movie that came out after Divergent, but before Insurgent. And those movies came out 6 months apart. You would have thought that someone had seen the competing movie and said, hey, our ending is almost exactly verbatim. Shouldn't we change that to try and make it a little bit more interesting? No, apparently not. So now we have this movie that's, half a year down from the previous Maze Runner movie that has an exact same setup, in that they're leaving this experiment that they've spent much of their time in and exploring this world beyond and the people that have been controlling that previous experiment. Divergent doesn't really do anything new with that premise. In fact, if you've seen the Scorch Trials, it's an even bigger hindrance because you know exactly what's going to happen here. Not that it takes a genius to work out what exactly is happening here, but it takes this movie almost 2 hours to do what the Maze Runner did in its first 45 minutes. The two movies have the issue in that the follow-up has to disregard everything that we've set up in the previous movies, and in Divergent, the whole faction element was really the only interesting thing about them. It doesn't really know what to do with these characters because the characters are woefully underdeveloped. There's a reason why these actors look like, at times, they're almost close to mutiny. It's because, well, they fit into the faction system really well because they're one-dimensional. In some cases, I don't even think they are that. But when your supporting characters are doing the same things they've done in the previous movies and not doing them any differently, like, why are they bringing Miles Teller's Peter with them, who has betrayed them on several occasions in the past and is always a slimy, weaselly, self-interested douchebag who no one appears to like but apparently tags with them anyway? Do you think maybe at some point they might have considered them to themselves, you know what, let's not take the guy that will obviously stab us in the back at some point if it serves his own interests? Maybe just don't take him. They've dragged all these talented actors in there, not just young ones, but old ones too. The previous movies had Kate Winslet, who has wisely got out of this third instalment, but in her place we have Naomi Watts, who is basically doing the same thing that Kate Winslet was doing in the previous 2 movies. And there's this whole thing about her and Octavia Spencer having this sort of civil war over who controls Chicago, but really it's playing in the background. It doesn't really become central until the climax of the movie, but there's so little stakes because I just didn't care about anything because their world doesn't make any sense. There's no logic to anything that's happening, and what is happening is incredibly predictable. The new addition, Jeff Daniels, he's one of the best things in the movie. And that's not just because I really like Jeff Daniels. Jeff Daniels is a brilliant actor, especially when it comes to dialogue, and boy does he have a lot of dialogue. Because Daniels' role in this movie is basically do exposition for 2/3 of the movie. And, okay, if you're gonna have exposition, you might as well have it read out by a guy like Jeff Daniels, a guy who can make it sound convincing. That's why they've got him here, that he's a guy that can sell this stuff. He can make it sound very polished. But let's face it, this isn't Aaron Sorkin dialogue. He can make it sound Sorkin-esque just by his sheer presence. But let's not pretend that it is. This is very rigid stuff. Even though we've had all these characters for 3 movies, and supposedly the status quo has been destroyed at the start of this movie, really, it's all entirely for naught. Because it's soon quickly established that the status quo is very much back in play, that instead of the faction system, the rulers outside have separated them into pures or damaged. Now you may think that someone that labels people as being damaged might be a little bit mean and kind of, sinister in some way. I'm just going to leave that hanging there. So yes, we have a new hierarchy, we have a new conspiracy, a new world, and which means more exposition, and it basically resets itself. The movie goes in a circle. And this is meant to be building up towards the big finale. This is meant to be the two-part finale to the Divergent series, even though this is the third book, and the last movie, Ascendant, apparently is going to be completely original, which doesn't surprise me considering that the movies have diverged from their source material. If nothing else, Schwentke still has a really good eye for how the film looks. At times the film looks incredibly pretty, especially the initial vision of the world, this red scorched desert due to the acid rain falling from the sky, very sort of bloody and metaphorical of the sort of vicious war that led to the post-apocalyptic future. I like that visual, but then it's matched by some really terrible green screen and CGI work of people floating in bubbles and things like that. It seems like Schwentke isn't really interested in the story or the characters or anything that's going on. He just wants it to look really pretty. In the last movie, you'll remember that he kept using the sim for the second half of the movie so he could have these big CGI action sequences. Thankfully restrains from pulling that trick here, but instead his new trick is dividing the screen into cubes which break up and reverse, which is meant to evoke the surveillance footage, but is really, really overused here as a device, and it just feels like Schwentke's using this series as an excuse to just play with particular screen functions. It feels like someone who's got an editing package for the first time and keeps using all the fancy transitions. It's exactly like that. It's fitting for a series about personality how little there is on screen, and even audience members are probably thinking to themselves, well, at least I only have to sit through one more of these movies for completionist's sake, which is not the thought you want to have when you're building up towards a climax. In retrospect, it looks like the decision to break this up into two movies like Harry Potter and The Hunger Games is a serious mistake, especially given that this movie and Insurgent cost roughly around $100 million to make. Ascendant? More like arrogant. These YA movies are starting to feel tediously routine, and nothing about Allegiant, the latest entry in the ironically personality-free Divergent franchise, does anything to shake that feeling. If you ended up seeing Maze Runner: The Scorched Trials, this is almost identical, right down to the fact it feels lost, having abandoned its core premise, which it compensates for by quickly establishing the same status quo and going through the same motions again. The characters in this series, like Goldfish, never seem to progress or do anything different from film to film. Fans will be annoyed at how this diverges from the source material again, and the cast themselves look bored of being shackled to a lumbering Hunger Games cash-in, even Woodley herself, but at least Miles Teller's disdain adds some welcome humour to the po-faced seriousness, while the elder figures of Daniel, Spencer and Watt strain to add some legitimacy to an expensively bland CGI fest. The final entry in the series, Ascendant, will be released next year, which even lovers of Divergent will be probably looking forward to about as much as their next trip to the dentist. Until then, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.